Welcome to the enchanting world of Bella Brown's historical Western romance. I'm delighted to share this journey with you today. Before we ride into the story, if you enjoy these narrations, please consider subscribing to this channel. It's a small gesture that makes a big difference, and your support makes it possible to continue bringing these heartfelt tales to listeners everywhere, completely free of charge. Now find yourself a comfortable spot, close your eyes if you wish, and allow your imagination to travel back to the American frontier, where adventure and romance await. This audiobook presentation features Promises Under the Prairie Sky by Bella Brown, all rights reserved. Chapter 1. That's it. He's off. Abby wiped her brow as she leaned against the doorframe, watching the carriage roll off down the street. Who'd have thought one man and his mother would require so many things for a simple trip to Annapolis? Beth Morgan stood just behind the kitchen maid. The Desmonds' carriage couldn't retreat fast enough, and she knew Hayward Desmond was a man who required far more than even his money and his social stature ought to demand. She had to be grateful that for the moment, at least, she was away from him. That would only last a couple of weeks, but she would take what she could get for now. Yes, I think the house will be a lot quieter, if only for a little while. Certainly, for me. The man eats more than the rest of the household combined. Abby tucked a strand of her blonde hair back up into her cap and straightened her shoulders. Not that I won't still be busy. Having less food to cook and fewer dishes to wash only means that I'll be put to work scrubbing the far corners that I can't do when he's here. What about you? Beth pressed her lips together as they turned away from the door. I have some repairs to make to some of Mrs. Desmond's clothes, a few errands to do, and also some correspondence to catch up on. Abby was about to turn toward the kitchen, but she paused, her blue eyes homed in on Beth. Not that man out in Colorado again? The farmer? He's a miner, Beth corrected, though she wasn't sure that Henry Beckler's line of work mattered all that much. And yes, he's written once again, and what with the family leaving, I haven't had a chance to even open the envelope. I don't understand why you're interested in leaving at all, to be honest, Abby replied, shaking her head. Desmond House is one of the nicest places to work in Baltimore. We have a stable roof over our heads, and with the finances under the gimlet eye of old Mrs. Desmond, I do not doubt that we'll ever have to worry about our jobs. Not like some of the other wealthy ones who want to fritter it all away on silly baubles and then wonder why they suddenly can't afford to feed themselves anymore. I know, it's a very nice place to work, but she hesitated as she followed Abby back into the kitchen. It was a difficult thing to explain. Beth had rehearsed this conversation in her mind many times, and yet she could never get the actual words to come out of her mouth. There were too many things to worry about, and she couldn't possibly reveal her true secret until she knew she had a way out. I'm ready for a chance at something else. Abby sighed as she looked inside the pantry. She laid out 2 plates, some cheese, and a couple of leftover biscuits before she waved at one of the chairs for Beth to sit down. I suppose in a way I can't blame you. If you go off to Colorado and marry this Henry, then you'll be the lady of the house. You won't be sweeping up the dirt that comes in on Hayward's riding boots, and you won't be carefully dusting every facet of the chandelier in the front hall whilst his guests walk by you like you're not there. You'll be pointing the finger and having someone else do it. Beth's stomach rumbled. She'd hardly been able to get any breakfast down at all, and now her appetite was catching up with her. Layering the thick, strong cheese inside the biscuit and taking a bite, she closed her eyes. At that moment, it tasted better than anything she'd ever had. It likely wouldn't be enough, though. As she chewed, she thought about Abby's statement. It's not that I mind any of the hard work. It makes the day go by quickly, and I feel like I've accomplished something. Prosody Ratewell. You've always been an odd duck, Abby laughed. I don't think I know anyone else who would be wistful of all her hard labor once she's sitting in her finery with her teacup, surrounded by gold nuggets. Silver, Beth amended quickly. He owns a silver mine. It was his late father who had the gold mine. He has a son from his first wife, which means that he's old enough to know what he wants in life. As if that makes any difference, Abby snorted, smiling. Either way, I'm going to miss you terribly. Perhaps that's where I get all hung up in this. Tears burned at the backs of her eyes, and Beth quickly blinked them away. If she got this opportunity that she'd been trying so hard for, then she couldn't be anything but grateful. She didn't have any true family here, but she couldn't deny that Beth had become a fast friend. I'll be sure to write you. You'd better. And then I'll be the one who gets mysterious letters in from the West. Abby looked thoughtfully at the remainder of her biscuit. Ever since you started talking about scampering off to Colorado, I've been thinking about who a fitting replacement for you might be. Not that I want to replace you, she added quickly. It's just that if I have a chance to recommend someone for the position, then I'd like to take it. Of course. Beth had been so hungry only a moment ago, but now her stomach churned. She was determined to finish this small meal, though, not because she was hungry, but because she knew she needed the nourishment. Don't think I'm ungrateful for the work I've had here. I know it's a place many people think they'd like to work. She didn't add that the truth of that employment wasn't necessarily exactly as it seemed. Once again, Beth felt the urge to tell Abby what she knew. Fear stuck her tongue to the roof of her mouth. Indeed. You know, I thought my cousin Matilda might be perfect for the job. You've met her once or twice before, I believe. Abby polished off her biscuit, thought about it, and took an extra slice of cheese. Nobody will be missing this, what with Hayward being gone. Matilda? Beth searched around in her mind. There were so many people she'd met over a couple of years that she'd been working for the Desmonds. She was expected to remember every single one of them, as well as their preferences when it came to bed linens, or what time they liked to be woken up in the morning. But Abby's cousin wouldn't have been a guest during one of Mrs. Desmond's famous balls, or after a weekend dinner party. An image came to mind of Abby's cousin coming to the kitchen door to deliver eggs. She was of solid farm stock, a young woman with a full brow and a jaw like a lantern. Her muscled arms strained at the sleeves of her dress, and she hardly looked like a lady despite the frill of lace at her hem. Yes, I think Matilda might be just perfect. I'm glad you think so. You tell me as soon as you make your decision. That way I can contact Matilda and get a word in with Mrs. Jones before she has a chance to advertise the opening. I will, Beth promised, though it may be a while yet. Mr. Beckler has a lot of questions for me. He seems the sort of man who doesn't like to do anything without knowing all the information ahead of time. A sure sign of someone responsible, and likely a good husband, Abby replied with a nod. Heavy footsteps sounded in the doorway. Mrs. Jones stepped into the room, her chain of keys dangling at her wide hip. She gave Abby and Beth a weary but genuine smile. I do hope you girls aren't thinking you won't have any work to do now that it's just the missus in the house. Abby, there's a lot of silver to polish. Beth, all the bed linens need to be changed today. Yes, ma'am, they both echoed, gobbling up the last crumbs of their snacks and heading off to their work. It was a gentle nudge, hardly a reprimand at all, but that was all it took from Mrs. Jones. She was like a grandmother to them, and they didn't want to disappoint her. Beth scrambled up the stairs and began her duties for the afternoon. Just as Abby would be catching up on things in the kitchen, so she would be doing the same in the rest of the house. The books would be dusted, the bed linens changed, the rugs beaten, and every last inch of the fancy woodwork would be polished. She bundled up the bedclothes in Mrs. Desmond's room and carried them out into the upstairs hall. Next came Hayward's room, but Beth shuddered and went past. She would save his room for last. Later that evening, when her arms and legs were fatigued from bringing countless baskets of linens out to wash, scrubbing them in the yard, and then hanging them out to dry, Beth sat in her little room under the roof. She held the latest letter from Henry Beckler, her fingers shaking. She had to open it and see what he'd said, expecting it to be another sharp, pointed list of questions. Beckler wasn't a man who talked of romance or an eventual love. He didn't even mention living happily together. The woman who became his wife would be filling a position, just as Matilda would fill Beth's position here at Desmond House. More than she feared another iteration of questions. as well as the amount of time it would take for her letter to reach him and then for his to come back in return, Beth dreaded his rejection. It would be easy for a rich, well-known man like Henry Beckler to simply pick a woman from the town where he lived. If he didn't have any interest in marrying her, then she'd have to start the process of finding a husband all over again. Beth didn't have time for that, and she knew it. Henry was her last hope. Now shaking so hard that she barely got the tip of her finger under the flap, Beth broke the seal and saw Henry's neat, familiar handwriting. The message was short and to the point. It was the proposal she'd been waiting for, succinct, unemotional, and to the point. There were no further questions, and no demands beyond an immediate reply to let him know what train she'd be arriving on. Instead of being elated, she felt completely exhausted. She'd been preying on this for so long, yet now she had his marriage request. It brought with it a whole new set of problems. Working out her notice, packing up her belongings, riding a train into a world so far unknown to her, bar a few laconic explanations from a man she'd never met. She knew she needed her rest, but she'd never get it at this point. She set the letter aside and opened the little box she kept on the small table near the window. The last of her money would be just enough for a train ticket. She'd worked hard to save up that amount, and she was about to spend it all in one go. She didn't even think about the ramifications of traveling west as a penniless maid. This was what was going to save her, and so it was worth it. Chapter 2. Dakota Langhorne touched his pocket, ensuring that the packet of papers was still right where he'd put it. There was no reason for him to have lost it on this short journey, but he knew they were the only things that might help him in this situation. Anger flooded through him as he marched up to the office of the Beckler silver mine, but he tried to temper it. Coming in hot and yelling probably wouldn't do him any good, and he needed every advantage he could leverage. He knew before he even crossed the threshold, however, that he was already at a steep disadvantage. Plenty of mines ran their offices out of little more than a shack, a hastily scraped-together construction that was just enough to hold a desk and some paperwork, but little else. Not so for the Beckler silver mine. No expense had been spared, likely fueled by the Beckler gold mine that was just a few rocky ridges away from here. The wide windows held broad expanses of glass that looked out over the road and the surrounding territory, and the gleaming woodwork had been carefully set in place. When Dakota stepped inside, he could hardly tell if he was still in his uncivilized homelands or one of the plush buildings he'd read about in the papers from the east. A slim man with wireframe glasses perched on the end of his thin nose looked up from his paperwork. Dakota slowly removed his hat, drawing himself up to his full height as he pushed his fingers through his inky black hair. The look on the man slid from polite to sneering instantaneously. "Yes? I'm here to speak with Henry Beckler," Dakota stated. "Impossible," the slim man replied, his gaze returning to his work. Dakota had known he would be denied, and he was ready for it. It was the same treatment each time he'd stood here trying to get an audience with the mine owner. "You're telling me he's not here?" "I'm telling you that he's busy," the man replied tightly. "State your name and your business. He will write and let you know when he can see you." We both know that's never going to happen. It certainly hadn't happened before, and Dakota had already tried on several occasions to get a hold of the powerful Mr. Beckler. It shouldn't be this hard, but if the man wanted to make it that way, then so be it. I'll just go on back to his office. No, I'm afraid you can't do that." The man was out of his seat, his hands fluttering. "He's very busy right now." Dakota paused and smiled lazily. "Conducting mine business?" "Yes." The man adjusted his jacket about his shoulders, looking pleased that he'd finally gotten through to the unwelcome visitor. "Yes, exactly that." "Good, because it's mine business that I'd like to talk to him about." Dakota made the last few strides to the door at the back of the room, the one with Henry Beckler's name carefully painted on the glass, and thrust it open. "Good heavens, Roland. What's the matter that you've come crashing in here like a herd of bison?" A man with broad shoulders turned away from his desk. His frown of disapproval for his employee quickly darkened to a thunderous expression of contempt. "Langhorne. Beckler, Dakota returned, tamping down on the fury that bubbled in his blood. "It seems that you've been avoiding me. And why shouldn't I? You're nothing but a fly buzzing around my supper table. I have work to do, and I don't have any time to waste on the likes of you." Beckler's eyes were hard as nails. "I'm so sorry, sir," Roland said, trying to peer over Dakota's shoulder. "I told him he wasn't allowed in. He wouldn't listen. I did try." "Enough, Roland." Henry snapped. "I don't want to hear your driveling. Get back to your work." Prosody reticent. "I'll deal with this problem since you obviously can't." A small surge of hope built in Dakota's chest, but he tempered it. He'd gotten further on today's visit than he had in months, but just because Henry Beckler was finally willing to speak with him didn't mean this would go in his favor. Dakota waited until Roland had returned to his desk. "Mr. Beckler, this isn't the way I wanted to do this, by pushing my way in here, but you've left me with no choice." Henry Beckler folded his arms and glowered at him. "I've stopped by many a time, leaving with an assurance that you would reply to my letters." The silence rolled on. Dakota caught himself from wanting to fill it in inanely. He clamped his jaw tighter, frustration hammering at his pulse. "Unless Roland is as inept as you say, and you've not received them." "I have," Beckler growled. He leaned back in his chair and propped his boots up on the desk, managing to look down his nose at Dakota, even though he was at a lower vantage point. "I just don't have any time to waste on some mutt who thinks he has business with me." Dakota felt his blood begin to boil. His heritage put him in a position of not belonging anywhere. His mother's Navajo side dismissed him because of the white man's blood that ran through his veins. And the settlers saw him only as a savage. He'd straddled both worlds for his whole life, belonging to neither side fully, treading a fine line of building a life for himself that blended his culture as best he could. With all of that, it was no shock to hear Henry Beckler speak to him this way, and Dakota knew that acknowledging it would only feed into the power Henry felt. "You've been mining under my land again." "Is that right?" Henry asked casually. "Yes, though you already know that. I suggest you cease right now before I do something about it." A deep, rumbling laugh issued from Henry's chest. He linked his fingers across his rotund belly. "You will you?" Dakota knew better than to push the threat anymore. Henry Beckler was renowned for taunting a man into making a mistake that ended up costing them dearly. "I can't find the humor in it myself." Beckler wiped an invisible tear from his eye. "Then you should view it from this side of the desk." Dakota stared the other man down until Beckler's smile faded, and the scorn was back in place. "You know as well as I do that the sheriff isn't going to care very much what you have to say to him, Langhorne." He was right, and Dakota knew it, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. "I've claimed my land, just the same way you or anyone else has. I've built on it, improved it. I'm living on it. My land, Beckler. I've got my patent. I haven't cheated the system the way you have." He let the derision edge his voice. "Cheated?" Henry held his hand up, palms out. "That's a mighty big word to be tossing about in my office. You sure you know what it means?" "Do you?" Dakota spat. "I happen to own all of this land, free and clear of any liens. Now you can run off to the sheriff all you want with that, because I've got the paperwork to prove it." Dakota didn't doubt that, nor did he doubt that Henry had enlisted his employees to claim the land in mining territory and then sign it over to him as soon as they had the rights. It was happening all over, undermining the intention of the law that allowed U.S. citizens to expand westward. Dakota had seen plenty of other terrible things happen in the name of expansion, but he'd also seen that nobody was particularly willing to do anything about it. "I've got my paperwork too," he retorted. "Prosody. I've got the deed saying that my land belongs to me, and yet you're digging minerals out from under it like an overgrown mole." Henry's boots slid off the desk, his eyes glinting with animosity. "You've got some nerve coming into my establishment and calling a man doing an honest day's work names." Dakota snorted derisively, which brought Henry to his feet. Red-faced, he bared his teeth. "Get out." Dakota leaned in, unblinking. "Stay off my land." Henry leaned forward, planting his hands firmly on his desk. "What proof do you have of this so-called infringement, Langhorne? Do you see me over there every morning with a shovel?" He laughed at his own joke. No, I don't think so, and I don't think you have a clue what you're talking about. Now, why don't you slide back under whatever rock you crawled out from under and leave me to get on with my day? I'm not leaving here until you admit to what you're doing and agree to quit it. Then you're going to have a long wait. Some of us got work to be getting on with, and I have somewhere to be. Dakota watched him rise from his desk and put on his jacket. If Henry thought he could just walk away, then he had another thing coming. Dakota followed the other man, out of his office and into the lobby, and then out onto the dusty road that serviced this little settlement that had popped up out of necessity for the mining community. I meant what I said, Beckler, Dakota called after him. Let's settle this grievance like men. Beckler made long strides toward a sprawling house that sat a short distance from the office. Judging by the fresh dirt around the foundation, he'd just finished building it. I think I've already made myself clear, Langhorne. You go trot along and tell the sheriff. Go with my blessing. I have far bigger fish to fry than to worry about what some petty landowner thinks about the way I do business. This isn't about business. Dakota easily passed him by and moved to stand in front of him as they neared the house. This is far more personal than that, and you know it. This used to be a peaceful area, but as soon as you and all of your equipment moved in here, it's been about nothing but the almighty dollar. Henry finally lost his temper. What's the matter with you? He yelled, his hands shooting wide. What else is it about, other than making a buck? Why else are any of us out here? Or are you that stuck in your heathen ways that you can't figure out why else would men risk their lives to haul the silver out of the mines? If you don't get it, then I just might have to feel sorry for you. Not sorry enough to stay off my land. Dakota retorted, surprised at the elation he felt over finally having cracked the big mine owner's facade. It likely still wouldn't get him what he wanted, but it was good to know he'd finally gotten under his skin. It's your land, is it? Henry bellowed. Excuse me. Well, you give it a little bit of time, and it won't be your land at all. I happen to have some good friends in the land office, the kind who know when a mistake was made on a deed, the kind who ensured that I was able to mop up all the little pockets of land I wanted around my property. The only reason I don't already own yours is because I don't need to. Excuse me. A throat cleared. Henry barreled on regardless. I'll do whatever I dang well please around here. Heck, I'll do whatever I want to with your land too, if the mood strikes me. But Dakota wasn't paying any attention to the raving mine owner any longer. At some point during their quarrel, a woman had walked up the path to the house. Silver Hill was a small community, and Dakota was fairly certain that he knew everyone in it, but he'd never seen her before. Her eyes were a brilliant blue, the same shade as her dress. The dust that lined the hem suggested that she'd traveled a long way, as did the errant curl that escaped from her bonnet. Those gorgeous eyes darted back and forth between the two men, and she was just starting to back away when Dakota looked at her. I'm so sorry to bother you, she began quietly. I'm looking for Henry Beckler, and I didn't see anyone else to ask. Even Henry stopped his tirade to look at her. Don't tell me you're Beth Morgan? She nodded gravely. Yes, sir, I am. Now see what you've done, Langhorne. All this trouble that you've stirred up has made me late. I was supposed to pick her up at the station. You go on and get yourself out of here before I do something we'll both regret. I've got things to attend to. A wave of Henry's hand dismissed Dakota, and without further ado, he then guided the mysterious Beth Morgan toward his huge house. Dakota stood with his feet rooted to the ground. All the ire that he'd built up suddenly melted from his body. He watched the two of them step up onto the grand covered porch, and he couldn't help but wonder what her business was here. A new maid, perhaps? A relation of Beckler's? No. Dakota doubted that last part very much. Nobody as beautiful as that could be related to a vicious monster as Henry Beckler. Another possibility occurred to him, but it was one he didn't like. Dakota strode across the yard, untethering his horse. He swung up into the saddle, casting a long look back at the house. She was ushered inside, and she didn't look back. Dakota tapped his heels, his mind churning. He hoped that the pretty young lady hadn't burdened herself with a brute like Henry. knowing that he wouldn't be able to get her off his mind for a long time. Chapter 3. "You've arrived, then," came Henry Beckler's simple greeting. There was nothing warm or affectionate in his tone, and Beth reminded herself that she had no reason to expect such a thing. She was to be wed, but it was the same as being hired for a job. It was a position she was very fortunate to get, and she knew she had to be careful. She couldn't risk losing this chance. "Yes, I'm told the coach made good time." That was a true enough statement. The train ride had been fairly long and tedious, with few people to talk to and long stretches of vast, grassy plains before it neared the mountains. Beth had been glad to make the transfer to the stagecoach, knowing that it represented the last leg of her journey and the new start to her life. What she hadn't expected, however, was for the driver to go racing through the mountains as though he had a death wish. He paid little heed to the speed with which he took the curving roads, sending his passengers careening into each other each time. At one point, he'd had to make room for a carriage coming in the other direction. Beth had watched in horror as the wheels of the carriage drew closer and closer to the sheer edge, sure that they would all meet their certain death in a crash of spinning wheels and horses' hooves. Never had she been so glad to put her feet back on solid earth, though her stomach was still reeling from the experience. "I would have been there to pick you up, as I'd said in my letter. But as you can see, my work kept me busy," Henry grumbled as he reached for the door handle. There was no apology, nor did he ask how she had managed to get from the swing station up to his property. She did catch the dark look he aimed at the retreating stranger who rode out of the yard. Beth entered the sumptuous home and couldn't help but stare. This home demanded a woman of a certain status, the kind of woman who didn't simply pick up her skirts and walk several miles along dusty roads after she reached the swing station and found that she'd been forsaken. No, this wasn't a place for the likes of her in several respects, and it was better if Henry didn't know this. "I'll show you the rest of the place shortly, but first there's something we need to discuss." Henry quickly steered her past the grand fireplace flanked by bookcases and across beautiful rugs. They made a sharp turn in the hallway and into his study, where he closed the door soundly behind him and looked at her sharply. "I know I asked you several questions in my letters. Tell me, did you answer those honestly?" "I did," she replied with a nod. Beth swallowed, hoping he couldn't see just how frightened she was. Henry was a big man, and she'd already seen his face the color of a ripe berry as he lost his temper. Though it was true she hadn't expected anything other than to get down to business, Henry was even more brusque than his letters had suggested. "Good. Here's the thing, Miss Morgan. I've already been married once, that you know. That resulted in my son Sterling and the death of my first wife. Life goes on, and I've been a very busy man." Henry left her to stand there in front of a large oak desk while he moved around behind it. He put his hands on his hips, appraising her like a cow on the auction block. "I need to ensure my legacy and one son isn't enough to put me at ease. I want a woman who can bear my children and be my wife. I have a maid and a cook, but the house would be your domain. Is that clear?" Beth felt as though she were a child being scolded, and she hadn't even had the chance to do anything wrong yet. "Yes, sir." The barest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and Beth thought it was probably due to the way she'd addressed him. Henry was clearly the sort of man who wanted to be in charge and for everyone else to know it. Good. Now, that means the house and only the house. I don't need some meddling woman to get involved in my business or my financial affairs. You're to mind the house and raise all the children. "Yes, sir," Beth repeated. It wouldn't be the life she dreamed of when she was a little girl. But Beth had known for a while now that those dreams would never come true. All she could hope for now was a roof over her head. "We've got that settled, then. I want to be properly wed very soon because I don't like to leave loose ends lying around. That's not how a successful man does business. My mother lives here, though, so it'll still be appropriate for you to stay here and get to know the place until we can have the ceremony." Moving with surprising speed, Henry was back around his desk and opening the door. I'll show you around, but then I have to get back to work. Thank you, she said, mostly because she wasn't sure what else to say. Anything that showed gratitude and subservience was likely to please him, she guessed. You've already seen my study, he began, gesturing toward the room they'd just left. You're to knock before you come in. If the door is closed, then I don't want to be disturbed. The parlor is just over here, which is where I take my breakfast. The kitchen is that way, which I'm sure you can make your acquaintance with. Beth scurried after him, his long strides making very little work of the huge home, listening to his rules and regulations. For the most part, it sounded as though he wanted to do nothing but work and leave the rest up to her. She was to warm his bed on the nights he chose and to be in charge of the house staff. He was very clear in stating, but he expected everything to always be neat and tidy. Of all the instructions that tripped off his tongue as he showed her his magnificent home, it was the cleaning and being neat that she knew she could do with ease. She just had to keep him happy. After they'd hurried through about half of the first floor, Henry paused and glanced at his pocket watch. I've got to get back to the office and take care of some things. I'll leave you with my mother, and she can show you the rest of the house. I have a man around here somewhere if you need help getting your bags inside. She wondered if he'd even noticed that her worldly belongings had been in her hand the whole time. Her whole life was contained within the battered valise. She was left wondering what kind of woman his first wife was, and knew that this new life she'd pushed for was going to be a very interesting adjustment indeed. Chapter 4. We'll have to get you a maid, a proper one who can do your hair up nicely, better than these old, twisted fingers. Beth smiled in the mirror at the old woman who stood behind her. You didn't have to go to the trouble. I could have put it in a braid. What you've done is lovely, though, she hastened to reassure her future mother-in-law. Mrs. Beckler's fingers carefully rearranged several curls around Beth's head. Oh, now, a braid is fine if you're going to be doing hard work all day, but you're about to become the most important woman in Silver Hill. You need something more fitting. Henry has a certain way he thinks things should be, and I wouldn't want to upset him. Beth noted the slight tremble in Mrs. Beckler's voice. She'd only just met her yesterday, but already she felt that she knew her well. Henry's mother was sweet and kind, but she walked a fine line to make sure she didn't make her son angry. Henry was the ruler of this house, even though Beth was the one who would be in charge of it. A hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach was steadily growing. Beth had thought that this marriage to Henry would be just the solution she needed to her problem, the right way to stow her secret and ensure that it never came to light. Now that she was here, the reality of it all was settling much more heavily on her shoulders than she'd expected. Beth turned away from the mirror. Mrs. Beckler? Do call me Isabella, dear, the older woman replied with a smile as she opened a small box on the vanity and removed a long, fine string of pearls. I think these would look lovely with your gown. A bit much for a day at home, perhaps, but Henry will be pleased to see how they look on you. They were mine, but I'd like you to have them. Oh. Beth wanted very much to push those beautiful pearls away, but she found that she didn't know how to stop Isabella's hands as they carefully clasped the necklace around her throat. The little pale beads felt like silk against her skin, a luxury she most certainly didn't deserve. The guilt of it drove her onward. I suppose we should start talking about the wedding, Isabella continued as she carefully and delicately adjusted the necklace and then retrieved a matching pair of earrings from the little box. There's only so much we can do with it being relatively short notice. We get certain supplies this far out, mostly because Henry has such close ties with all the local traders, but nothing moves as quickly as it does further east. What I mean to say is that you may not get your pick of fabrics for your dress, but we'll do our best. The pearls were so gorgeous, but they only made Beth feel ruthless and undeserving. I'm not too particular. I believe I saw some green material down at the general store, Isabella mused. We'll have to see how the color looks on you. That's not always an easy one to match, and I'm rather surprised that they even brought it in. We want to be sure you're the most beautiful bride. Henry wouldn't want it any other way. Henry seems to be a very astute man, the kind who doesn't miss a thing. Beth didn't think most men would care all that much about the color of their bride's dress. Well, of course, Isabella agreed, her voice a mixture of pride and reverence. That's exactly why he's been able to build such a large mining company. His father's gold mine was certainly a good start, and it meant that he learned from the best. But Henry, he likes things done in a certain way. He won't accept anything less. His letters showed me just how particular he could be. Beth swallowed, but the lump in her throat refused to go away. I suppose he has the pick of the town with eligible women. Isabella stood back and appraised her. She was a much older woman than Beth, but she had plenty of light left in her eyes. He does, though the women here are tough and determined. It's the landscape that makes them that way, you see. There are things around here that will kill you as soon as look at you, and not all of them on 4 legs. She offered Beth a smile, trying to soothe the sound of strangled anguish that she made. You're a much younger and prettier woman than I imagined would be coming. I think some men would find that to be more than enough, and certainly they should. Henry, though, she paused, her lips twisting into a circle of concern. Henry is a very discerning man. He doesn't have time for a wife who will argue back with him. He doesn't want a woman that will make a spectacle of him by standing up to him. That was a kind way to put it, Beth thought, understanding that Isabella was warning her to be compliant if she wanted to get along with Henry. This woman was just as intimidated by her son as anyone else might be. Beth had seen for herself just how domineering Henry had been already towards Isabella. She'd tried more than once to be heard during his ranting in the yard as she'd walked up yesterday. Her mind had wandered back to that incident several times as she wondered what had been going on there. An extra pang of guilt crossed through her heart as she considered how handsome the other man had been, how kindly he had looked at her. From only the briefest of interactions, it was clear that he wasn't the same as Henry. She was no longer allowed to look at another man now that she was to be Mrs. Beckler, let alone allow her thoughts to be so covetous when she found herself thinking about the kind of wife a man like that would have. Henry was the one she was marrying soon, and the one she needed to be worried about right now. The warnings within Isabella's words had also made up her mind. If Henry was as discerning as she had heard, then he wouldn't care to be duped. She would explain her situation. She would be up front with him from that start, rather than start her married life in a lie that would haunt her forever. I think perhaps I should talk to him before we get much of the wedding planning underway. Isabella frowned, but she nodded. If you think that's best, although he won't have much time. He's probably finishing his breakfast right now, and he likes to get to work straight away. Beth tried to put the older woman's alarmed face out of her mind as she headed quickly down the stairs. If even his mother was afraid of him, then how should Beth feel about her future husband? The conversation she was about to have with him would tell her. He wasn't the sort of man that could be tricked. He would discover her secrets sooner or later, and Beth couldn't stand the idea of waiting around to see what he might do about it. "Good morning," she said as she stepped into the parlor. Beth consciously lifted her chin, hoping to find the confidence that she would need for this. He sat with a steaming cup of coffee next to him as he frowned over a newspaper, and he didn't even look up when she entered the room. "Mornin'." Beth twisted her fingers together and then pressed them against the skirt of her dress to keep them still. "I know you're busy today, but there were a few things I hoped we could discuss." Now he did look up, but he didn't look happy. Henry frowned at her for a moment before he consulted his pocket watch. "I have only a few minutes to spare. In the future, if you want to have a discussion, we'll need to get it worked into my schedule." Isabella had said he liked to have his way, and she wasn't exaggerating. It slew 7%. "My apologies for the short notice. It's just that there's something very important that truly can't wait any longer." His heavy brows drew together, and the paper slackened in his hand. "If this has anything to do with plans for the wedding, then refer all of that to my mother. She said she wanted to have a hand in it. You women do all the fussing you like, as long as you look good on my arm." Not exactly about the wedding. The lump in her throat and the hollow in her stomach were both growing. This wasn't easy. She reminded herself that it wouldn't be any easier if she waited until after she had a gold band on her finger. Out with it, he snapped impatiently. Beth hauled in a deep breath. As you know, I was working as a maid in a home before I came here. I thought it might not be a terrible thing that you would know the inner workings of how a proper household is run. Beth nodded. I believe that was an accurate assessment on your part. It's just that sometimes the person who owns such a house decides to take advantage of his staff. Such a man might take liberties that he shouldn't, particularly if he feels there isn't anyone who will stop him. A sudden rush of tears clamped off her words, and she looked to the floor, trying to get her emotions under control. Henry was so still that he looked like a painting. What exactly are you trying to say, Miss Morgan? She'd hoped to be more circumspect about the whole thing. Beth could understand, however, why anyone would want a more direct accounting of just what the problem was. She touched her stomach just below the waist of her dress. I wouldn't be entering into this marriage alone, Mr. Beckler. Is that so? His eyes darted to her hand for only the swiftest second before they returned to her face. His own was starting to turn a deep shade of pink. You are, with child? Her teeth pressed hard together as she nodded. She felt her face flushing, though she was certain it was for different reasons than Henry's. It was so unfair and humiliating. Beth had thought her whole life would change once she'd been able to get a position in a house like that of the Desmonds, but she'd been so wrong. Would you care to tell me why you came all the way out here instead of dealing with this back in Maryland? Henry demanded. Beth took a slight step back, as though his harsh words had a physical effect on her. Though her insides were shaking, there was no getting out of this now. She'd already told him the hardest part, and so the rest of it was just details. I tried, she replied, her throat dry. I told him what had happened, but he claimed it didn't have anything to do with him. There was no other way for this to have happened, though. I'd never lain with a man before that day. Henry gave her only a curt nod when she risked a glance at him. Beth rushed on. He said he wouldn't acknowledge the child or do anything about it. At first, he called me a liar, but it was the truth, Mr. Beckler. I swear, he told me that nobody would believe me if I tried to say anything about it. What else do you expect when you lie with a man? He yelled. Beth squeezed her eyes shut. I wasn't given a choice, sir. Likely story. My guess is that you were looking for an easy way to a comfortable life and thought you'd trick a good, honest man, much like you tried to do here. Beth's eyes flew up. That's not it. I tried to stop him then afterward. Who would believe me? I couldn't tell anyone. His mother is a kind soul, and I wouldn't want to hurt her, but... Tears fell as she recalled that conversation with Hayward Desmond. Prosody rate %. He is a wealthy and popular man, and he said plenty of women would create such schemes if they thought it might earn them a good marriage. It wasn't as though Beth had expected Hayward to be happy about the news, of course. If anything, she thought he might send her out to have the baby on his country estate, out of the prying eyes of society, but with a small sum of money to ensure the child was taken care of. It wouldn't have been the life Beth would have wanted for herself or her offspring, but she'd learned at a very young age that she seldom got what she wanted. He's right, Henry announced, snapping her back into the present as he shot up from his chair. He clasped his hands behind his back as he strolled over to the window and looked out of it, his face hard and brooding. There are plenty of scheming women out there. If you hadn't been one of them when you spoke to your former employer, then you certainly became one when you started to write to me. Horror crawled over her skin as she realized just how right he was. Hayward was the one who'd put her in this situation, but it was her desperate actions in trying to marry Henry that had made her into exactly the sort of woman she hadn't wanted to be. I never really meant to deceive you. Didn't you? He roared, turning to face her now. You wrote multiple letters to me as we discussed your future here, and yet you never once mentioned this particular problem of yours. I would think it would be a rather important thing to know, or did you think that I'm so stupid I would never figure it out? Desperation bloomed inside her. I didn't mean for it to be like that. You can claim whatever intentions you like, Miss Morgan, because they hardly mean a thing to me. The fact is that you knew and yet you didn't tell me. You waited until you were out here in Colorado, under my roof, before you bothered to open your mouth. I suppose I should consider myself lucky that you didn't wait until after our wedding vows? I just thought. No. His word was sharp and quick, like an arrow finding its target. You didn't think, or if you did, it was only in how best to snag yourself the wealthy husband you thought you deserved. Well, I'm not a man to be trifled with. The marriage is off, and you're to leave my house at once. He jabbed a finger towards the door to emphasize his point. Out. Her throat was too tight for any further words to emerge. Beth dashed from the room and back up the stairs. She was grateful to find that Isabella had retreated to some other part of the house, probably because she could tell from her son's booming voice that things hadn't gone well. It took only a moment to pack her valise, and she was careful to return the pearls and earrings to the little box on the vanity. They had never been truly hers, after all. Wiping at tears, she snatched up her valise and headed back to the top of the stairs. She grabbed the top of the newel post as grief and panic slammed into her. She bent at the waist, eyes shut tight, a silent sob stuck in her chest. Where was she to go? She had no family, no one waiting for her back in Maryland. She'd left her job without notice because she'd been in too much of a rush to get here before the pregnancy advanced too far. Without a reference, she couldn't get another job. Worse still, she'd used the last of her money to get here. She had a few wrinkled dollars in the bottom of her bag, but it was nowhere near enough to get her back across the country. Somewhere in the belly of the house, she heard something striking a wall, followed by a furious bellow. Henry. He'd been raving ferociously, but it seemed to be getting louder. Frightened now, she straightened and hurried down the stairs, erupting through the door and out into the sunshine. She ran along the drive she'd walked up only yesterday, leaving the magnificent house and a chance for a new life behind. She was all alone in the world, save for the child she carried, and she had no idea what to do next. Chapter 5. I'm sorry to hear about that, Dakota. Sterling Beckler glanced over to the ridge, toward the invisible boundary line between the land of his friend and that of his father. I can't say I'm surprised, though. Dakota felt a bit of guilt for describing the scenario to Sterling. I figured you would hear about it eventually, and it was better for you to get the true story before it got twisted by any of your father's men. Sterling pulled in a deep breath that came out as a harsh sigh. I can't argue with you. Father may deal in silver, but he rules everything here with an iron fist. If any of his employees tried to say anything against him, they'd soon find themselves looking for a new occupation without any references. I just hope this new wife of his might settle him down for a while. New wife? Dakota hadn't forgotten about the pretty young woman who'd shown up in front of Beckler's house the previous day. He'd let himself hope and believe that she might be there for almost any other reason but marriage. Nuptials, however, were far more likely, and now Sterling had confirmed it. Oh, yeah. Sterling leaned back in the saddle. He took his feet out of the stirrups and stretched his legs. It's been well over a decade since my mother passed, God rest her soul, and I never thought he'd bother with a wife again. He's too engrossed in his profits and contracts to think about much else. But he's changed his mind. It was none of his business, particularly since Henry Beckler was his enemy in every way. But the woman herself was what intrigued him. Beth, he thought he heard Henry say, how could someone as delicate and pretty as her have anything to do with the bullish Henry? Sterling shrugged. Only in the sense that he's decided this is another aspect of his business he needs to take care of. Dakota shook his head. I don't follow. I'm the only heir, Sterling clarified with a raised brow. That's been just fine with him for a long time, and he's even said he was glad Mother at least had the decency to give him a son before she went to heaven. Now, however, he's starting to think that perhaps he needs a little bit of backup. What if something happens to me? What if I don't provide him with a grandson? Legacy is important to my father. It figured that Henry would look at the pretty Beth as nothing more than a business proposition. A new flash of anger raced through him. Plenty of men would treat women that way, and he shouldn't be surprised. But he felt an odd sense of protection over Beth, even though he'd not even been formally introduced to her. "I don't suppose it helped when I questioned my father on some of his scheming tactics," Sterling said quietly, and Dakota had the sense that all was not well between them. "And he didn't appreciate your input." That earned another sigh from Sterling. "Not in the least. The next thing I know, my grandmother informs me that he's secured a wife and I'll be a big brother soon enough." Dakota's gaze mirrored the path of the younger Beckler. He had his father's stature and coloring, though none of his bluster, nor the arrogance. Dakota wondered if it had been beaten out of him years ago by Beckler Sr. The two of them stood at the end of the long sliver land that led up to his humble cabin, surrounded on either side by thick trees. Spring flowers carpeted the meadow, and he could hear the rush of water from the stream that bisected his property. Sterling moved fluidly as his horse adjusted his stance a little as he said, "I can't seem to get him to do anything unless he thinks it's his idea, but I'll try to find a way to talk to him about your land." Dakota's mouth flattened into a firm line. "I appreciate it, but don't put yourself out. You've drawn a hard enough lot in life that you have to deal with him as your father." With laughter and a few more jokes, the two men parted. Sterling Beckler had always been a fair man, approachable and intelligent, without any of the bias and prejudice that seemed ingrained into many of the ranchers and farmers who built their lives on lands here. Sterling knew of the customs that were attached to the lands, and was always mindful of the cultures, turning a blind eye if a deer or cow vanished in the dead of winter. Dakota wasn't a man to wish his life away, and he wondered if Beth bore Henry Beckler a son, what would happen to the genial Sterling. He rode slowly up the lane, drinking in the silence and stillness of his property. Henry would likely continue doing everything in his power to get this land away from him and add it to the vast tracts that Beckler Silver already owned, but Dakota would never stop fighting. He wouldn't hold out any hope that Henry's marriage to Beth would make a difference, either. Some men were softened by a woman's presence, but Dakota was quite certain Henry wasn't one of those men. The crack of a twig had both his attention and his horse's. Dakota pulled his gelding to a halt as he listened for more. Now it was not just a twig breaking from a footstep, but the crashing of bushes as something went through them. Dakota braced himself. No wild animal would make that much noise. Was it one of Henry's men? Were they blatantly working on his property now, thinking they could establish some sort of rights by doing so? Slowly, he flipped the leather band off the pistol at his hip, his hand hovering as he studied the tree line. The sounds grew louder, his horse dancing nervously. He never expected the figure that emerged onto the lane. A woman streaked out of the woods, her pale pink dress torn at the hem and leaves sticking out from her bonnet. She flapped her hands desperately around her head as she paused to look back the way she'd come. Dakota swung down out of the saddle, and the sound of his boots hitting the dirt caused her to whirl on the spot, her sudden inhale sounding more like a yelp. It was Beth. There was no mistaking those brilliant blue eyes, though they were full of fear just now. That same protective urge came over him, and he was soon at her side. Was Henry following her? What's wrong? Bees. She slapped at her bonnet again, only to send a harmless leaf floating to the ground. Well, first I saw a snake. It was just sitting there, staring and not moving. I've never seen such a creature in my life. I went around it because it looked dangerous. They are, he murmured as he began to look her over, but then he realized the impertinence of the act, no matter that he was trying to help, and ran right into a nest of wretched bees. Did they sting you? Dakota focused on her eyes instead, which was an easy enough thing to do. Are you injured? I don't think so. She looked back to the woods she'd just emerged from to be sure nothing else was coming after her. I don't even know. Dakota put himself between her and the trees and felt the long pull of desire through his gut when she met his concerned gaze. Her words dried up, and they stared at each other. He cleared his throat, wondering if she could see the embarrassment crawling over his face. You were at the silver mine yesterday, she said to him. Up close, her blue eyes had flecks of lavender in them, and she had a dusting of gold over her nose. Her chin came down to a point, but the roundness of her cheeks softened her face. Even when she was flustered, she was beautiful. Yes, ma'am, he murmured, finally now wondering why she was out in the woods by herself. Are you alone? As if just being reminded of this fact, her breath shuddered out. Yes, sir. His mouth twitched. I'm no sir. Her lower lip trembled as she glanced back at the woods. He could tell that she'd been crying. The bees will only come after you while they think you're a threat to their hive, he explained gently. They probably stopped following you quite some time ago. She sniffed gently, her red-rimmed eyes filling with tears. He had to restrain himself by balling his hands when he itched to comfort her. Would you like to come and sit in the shade for a minute? I can get you something to drink. Her full lower lip slid between her teeth, and he could see the indecision warring on her face. How far away from the Beckler land am I? Dakota lifted a hand slowly. Index finger extended. You see where the land dips there? Where the grasslands finish and the trees start? This side of that fence is my land. Everything that side, from the hill that looks like a sleeping bison, beyond that mountain, is Beckler land. The answer didn't seem to ease her worries. My name is Dakota Langhorne, he said, offering her a hand. She stared at it like it was another snake, then placed her hand in his. Beth Morgan, she said wispily. A drink? A drink would be good. He gestured along the track that led to his house, tossing the reins over his shoulder. His horse ambled along behind them, and Dakota kept his gaze trained on the outline of his simple log cabin. He built it himself, rough timbers hewn from the trees he'd felled to make room for it. He tried to see it now through her eyes, acknowledging it was a far cry from the gray stones and fancy glass of the Beckler estate. After he secured his horse to the post, Dakota jogged over to the wellhead and pumped a cup of cold water. She was watching the forests around the cabin as he stepped onto the porch. Please sit, he offered, and handed her the cup as she sat on the rocking chair. He studied her as she wrapped both of her hands around it and sipped it gratefully. Sterling had said this woman was supposed to wed Henry, and Dakota imagined the mine owner would be angry beyond belief if he knew his future wife was sitting on Dakota's porch just then. She drained the cup and handed it back to him. Thank you. Dakota didn't mind Beth being here. He felt quite the opposite. But he also knew that if Henry Beckler found his fiancée here, or even if he got word of such a thing, he would likely take out his vengeance on her. I can take you back to Beckler's place and show you a way to avoid the bees. No, her voice was sharp. Her mouth moved a little, her eyes shining brightly with unshed tears. He allowed her a moment to gather herself. No, that's okay. Something within him was deeply unsettled at seeing the fear and uncertainty in her eyes. Did something else happen in the woods? She refused to look at him. No, not there. Dakota crouched down in front of her, resisting the urge to reach out and take her hand. Whatever it is, I'd like to help. When she finally looked at him, the redness that surrounded her eyes made the blue stand out even more than usual. I'm afraid there's not much you can do to help me, nor can anyone else. I'm with child, though not by choice. I thought a marriage to Henry would be the solution, but he's not interested. Dakota gaped at her as he grasped the reality of the situation. He'd fully expected her to say Henry was mean or had been overbearing with her, but not this. Her laugh was bitter. It's nothing that I don't deserve. Foolishly, I'd hoped to trick him, or at least throw myself on his mercy, or I don't know. Her bluster fell out of her voice and her chin dropped to her chest. This is God's way of punishing me. I lied to Mr. Beckler. That's the truth of the matter. Unsurprisingly, he's cast me out of his house, she continued. I wandered into the woods for some shade, and you know the rest. I'm sorry that I've disturbed you, and I thank you for being so hospitable. She rose, and Dakota copied her, frowning. Where are you going? She looked down the lane and then back at him before she attempted to straighten her bonnet. I don't really know. I don't have any place to go, so I'll just go. Back to the town. Perhaps the stagecoach will. She lost the battle with her emotions and tears tracked down her face. Dakota had questions, lots of them, but they would have to wait. His heart shattered as she bade him goodbye and stepped down off his porch. She had just reached the part of the track where the grass didn't grow anymore before he caught up with her. "Wait, Miss Morgan, you can't just go wandering off through the mountains, especially not in your condition. Come, I know a place. I'll get the wagon." Chapter 6. I see. Mildred Smith nodded her head when Dakota had finished explaining the situation. Mildred Smith stood ramrod straight. Her silvery hair was pulled back into a knot at the nape of her neck, and her bright brown eyes didn't miss a thing as she listened to her woeful story from Dakota. Beth hung her head, hardly even daring to look around her at the Silver Hill Lodge. Her first glances through tear-filled eyes told her it was quite nice, with quality rugs and a large dining area. She knew it would be just the sort of place she wouldn't be allowed to stay. She'd tried to tell Dakota as much on their trip back into town, but he hadn't listened. He'd only insisted that she trust him. Men always thought they knew what was right, even when they didn't. Dakota didn't have that arrogance about him that Hayward Desmond or Henry Beckler did, though he was somehow different. Dakota had explained that Mildred had started out the lodging with her husband and her spinster sister, both of whom had passed. Mildred had a kind heart and went against the rules by taking in single women whenever they arrived in the town. It surprised Beth to know that many of the miners, ranchers, and farmers in these parts had made a habit of bringing women from the east to start a family. "I thought you might be able to find her some lodgings for the time being," Dakota said gently to the innkeeper. "She doesn't have any money, but perhaps you and I can work out a trade. You like the eggs from my farm, and I smoked a few hams that would go down a treat with your guests. Maybe you have some odd jobs I can do in exchange." Beth shook her head, adamant that this man not put himself out for her. She didn't deserve it. "Please don't do that." Mrs. Smith was also shaking her head. "I agree with the girl. You're a good man, Dakota, and you've done plenty for me over the years we've known each other. I'd say I certainly owe you, and I'm not going to leave this poor thing out in the wilds. We can work something out until she's able to find her way back east. Come along, Beth. I'll find you a room." "Thank you, Mrs. Smith," Dakota called after them. Beth dared to turn her head as Mrs. Smith brought her down a long hallway, but Dakota was already gone. She frowned to herself, wondering why someone would be so kind to her of all people, especially knowing that she had deliberately tried to trick a man into marrying her. "That Dakota Langhorne is something else," Mrs. Smith grunted. "If only the rest of the men in Colorado were like him. I don't think he's got a dishonest bone in his body, or at least not that I've seen evidence of. I'm glad he brought you here." She opened the door to a small room. "I don't want to inconvenience you," Beth said, seeing that staying here truly was a reality. Now, I don't want to hear any of that. Come on in. It's not much, but I think it'll do just fine. I could use a bit of help around here if you think you're up to it. That might help assuage some of the guilt you seem to be feeling about staying here. I take it you know how to do some general housekeeping?" Beth felt a cold finger run down her spine as she recalled the last part of her employment at Desmond House. "Yes, ma'am, I do." "Right, silly me. Forgive an old woman whose mind doesn't seem to keep up. That was exactly what landed you here in the first place." Mrs. Smith clucked her tongue against the roof of her mouth as she adjusted the pillow and blankets. "I don't know what's the matter with some people, and you say you don't have any family we can help you get back to?" "Not a cousin or a sister," Beth bit her lip. "I grew up in an orphanage. If I have any family, I've never met them." Ah, the compassionate look on the innkeeper's face deepened as she took Beth's valise, a burden that she hadn't allowed Dakota to carry for her. "Poor child. Well, you've had at least one streak of luck." That was a surprising statement. "How so?" "That Henry Beckler is as ugly as the devil and twice as mean," Mrs. Smith declared with a raucous laugh. "I know you were hoping for a marriage, but you would never have been happy if you'd have ended up with a man like that. I think his former wife probably went on to heaven just so she could be away from the rotten man. May she rest in peace." Beth felt a hint of a smile tugging at her tear-stained face. "That's the spirit," Mrs. Smith encouraged. You clean up, have some supper, and then get some rest. We can talk more tomorrow and get all the details figured out. When the innkeeper had gone, Beth stood alone in the silent room. It was small and quaint, but it was far more than she ever could have asked for given her current predicament. She rinsed her face, staring at her reflection as she patted it dry. She'd gotten into quite the mess, but perhaps Mrs. Smith was right. Perhaps this little child, one that she hadn't had the chance to meet yet, had saved her from a terrible and uncertain future with a man like Henry Beckler. She had no idea just what her future would bring, but at least it looked brighter than it had earlier in the day. Though her worries still clouded her mind, Beth felt far better as she changed into a clean dress. She undid the complicated hairstyle dear Mrs. Desmond had arranged, now pitifully undone by her trip through the woods, and plaited it into a simple braid. She had nobody in the world, but it was good to know that at least some were kind enough to care. The small amount of peace that she'd found followed her into the next morning. She woke up feeling well-rested, and Mrs. Smith ensured that she had a hearty breakfast before she put her to work washing dishes. It wasn't an answer to her future, not completely, but it was a start. Beth started to wonder if she just might be able to find herself a whole new life here. Right now, she was of course working just to pay for her room and board. Silver Hill was a thriving little town, though, with far more people and businesses than she'd ever expected. Yes, she had some special circumstances to deal with, but she would have to figure that out no matter where she lived. If she could find a stable job and earn a bit of money, then she just might be all right after all. The din of the dining room was a comfort to her, and Beth enjoyed knowing that she was contributing to Mrs. Smith's efforts here. But it was soon interrupted by a loud bellow. I know you're hiding her here. Where is she? Beth went cold despite the warm water she'd heated up for the dishes. Though she'd only heard it a few times, she recognized that voice. What is this all about? Mrs. Smith, who didn't seem to be afraid of anything, was already handling the situation. Beth wanted to stay hidden in the kitchen. She never wanted to see Henry Beckler again, if she could avoid it. But it wasn't fair to make others fight her battles for her. She'd never had anyone to do it before, and so why should she start now? She dried her hands and pulled in a deep breath before she pushed open the kitchen door. There she is. Henry instantly pointed his thick finger at her. What do you think you're pulling here, Mildred? The innkeeper lifted her chin and straightened her shoulders. I am running a business, and I'd like to know what you think you're doing by disturbing my customers. Beth was impressed at her boldness, at the flinty stare she was aiming at the fearsome mine owner. I think your customers would be interested to know that you're hiding a single woman, a woman who has been shamed and lost all of her honor, here at your inn. An unmarried woman, living without the guidance and protection of any father figure or other male relative. You know that's going to spell nothing but trouble for this town. A town that we've fought hard to keep clean. We're not like other mining towns. Shame chilled her as eyes swung in her direction. She felt their judgment like drips of acid on her skin. She understood what Henry was implying. It insulted her to the bone, but she expected nothing different. She had indeed been shamed, but she wasn't about to try and explain her predicament to a room full of strangers. I'll go, Mrs. Smith. You will not, the innkeeper insisted. She stepped to the side to ensure that she stood between Henry and Beth. You had an agreement with this young woman, and you broke it. Henry's face was getting purple again at the insinuation that he was the one who'd put her in her current condition. That's not what happened. She tricked me, trying to pull the wool over my eyes. Then why did she tell you about it before you'd stepped foot in a church? She didn't want to start her married life in a lie, and in my book, that stands for something. Henry's face contorted. She's a harlot, seeking a man to fix her deceitful ways. You'd do well to put her out now. You don't want people to know you agree with unwed mothers and women seeking to trap a man. And who are you to say? Mrs. Smith challenged, clearly unafraid of the richest man in town. You won't marry the girl, and she has no place to go. I'm perfectly within my rights to let her stay here if I want to. It's my name on the deeds to this property, Beckler, and you are trespassing. As far as I can tell, what happens in Silver Hill lodgings isn't any of your business." Now that same meaty finger that had pointed at Beth was shaking in Mrs. Smith's face. "Do I need to remind you that I own half of this town?" "Oh, as though anyone would need a reminder of that. What with your name all over it?" The older woman's sarcastic comment drew a few muffled laughs from the gathered guests in the dining area. "Beckler this, Beckler that, we're all very aware, but the sign out front has my name on it." Henry wasn't the sort of man who was used to being argued with. Beth didn't have to know him very well to understand that. He sputtered and snorted for a moment before he fell back on his initial argument. "This woman can't stay here. She's a terrible influence on this town and our children. Now, hold on just a second." A slim man in a brown tweed suit stood up from his seat near the front window. "What kind of people are we if we take a woman, or any person for that matter, who's down on her luck and throw her out on the streets? Doesn't the good Lord teach us to help those who are in need?" Henry's face was positively thunderous now. "This is a completely different situation, Mayor Teague." Beth's stomach quailed at knowing that even the mayor was now caught up in deciding her future. "I don't think so," Mayor Teague countered. "The politicians in Congress are starting to talk more and more about ways that we need to be helping those around us. We're a little insulated from it here, being a small town in the mountains, but there are places in the cities that deliberate help those in need." "You can't deny that Miss Morgan's condition is a bad look for Silver Hill," Henry growled. The mayor's mouth tightened a bit. "I don't know all the details, but I believe I understand what you're saying. And what I'm saying is that perhaps there's a compromise to be made." "What's your name, young lady?" Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. Everyone in the room was staring at her. If she'd had a choice, she'd run out the back door and give Henry his way right then and there. But she didn't, and so she stayed. "Beth Morgan, sir." "Miss Morgan, do you not have anywhere to go?" "No family to take you in." She'd already been through this line of questioning and wondered how many more times she'd have to do it again. "No, sir, I have no family and no money." Mayor Teague nodded. "Right, what I propose is this. Miss Morgan stays here in Silver Hill while she earns some honest money. Then she can find herself a new place to settle down. What do we think, folks?" Though some of the diners only stared at Beth uncertainly, there were quite a few who nodded their agreement. "You most certainly can't count on my vote in the next election, Mayor Teague," Henry seethed. Teague was a much smaller man than Beckler, but he only smiled up at the big miner. "I'm pretty sure I didn't have it in the last one, Beckler. Now, if you'll excuse me, my eggs are getting cold." Beth slipped back into the kitchen, her body shaking. She had some time, but it wouldn't be enough. No matter how much money she earned, she had no place to go. The kindness of these folks could only take so much. She hadn't known Henry Beckler long, but what was it that his mother had said about him getting his way? Beth listened to the hum of chatter and clink of plates in the dining room beyond the door, not hearing the words yet, knowing that she was currently being discussed at length. She had no choice but to stay and try to earn her way back east, but could she outlast Henry's determination? She knew that she'd be driven out of town at some point, and then what? Chapter 7. Dakota waited until Sterling Beckler was closer before he called out, "You might not want to be seen on my land." Sterling paused, his horse fresh and eager, as his rider adjusted his hat to from at Dakota. "What's happened now? Your father has just accused me of squatting on his land." Sterling's brows drew together sharply. He wouldn't go that far. Dakota let loose a bark of disbelieving laughter. He held up the sheet of paper and flapped it. "Wouldn't he? Look at what a deputy just delivered to my doorstep this morning." Sterling dismounted and took the papers from Dakota. He liked to think of himself as a peaceful man, one who was more interested in compromising than in arguing, but Henry Beckler had a way of bringing out his temper in full force. "He's gone to the law, saying that I've been squatting on his land for years." "But you have your deed," Sterling contended, his brows drawing even closer together as he read the legal warning that his father's attorney had issued. Dakota snorted. Yes, but I doubt it would do any good when your father can buy the loyalty of anyone who might be able to help him out. I'm heading into town now with the hope of finding a lawyer, but I can't say that I have particularly high expectations. Sterling nodded. You'd have to find someone brave to stand up to him. I don't think you'll find such a thing in Silver Hill unless you have deep pockets. Dakota quirked a brow at Sterling. The younger Beckler sighed as he read the papers again. Dakota, this is going to be difficult to prove which one of you was there first, especially if he manages to convince a court that you falsified your homestead claim. Perhaps at the very least, I can get it to drag out in court and cause him some irritation. It won't be justice, but it would make me feel better by a small amount. Dakota shook his head as he took the paper back and stuffed it into his bag. I don't understand why he thinks he has to do this. He has plenty of land and plenty of work to keep himself occupied. His friend let out a long sigh. Nothing is ever enough when it comes to my father. Like the young woman he refused to marry? Dakota replied bitterly. Oh, you heard about that, did you? I was the one who found her, lost in the woods and terrified, Dakota explained. I took her over to Mrs. Smith, so at least she's safe from Henry. He'd thought about her much over the last few days, wondering just how Beth was doing. Though he'd been tempted, he'd resisted going over to the inn to talk to her. She had enough to deal with in her life without being associated with a man like him, a man who was caught between two worlds and would never belong to either one of them. Still, it was hard not to think about those big blue eyes and how sad and distraught they'd looked when he'd set her down on his porch and given her that cup of water. It had been the smallest gesture, something that anyone could have and should have done for her, and yet she'd held on to it as though it was the only thing she had. He'd found out soon enough that it was, and his heart ached. How could she not have anyone to turn to in dire times? Well, he could rest easy enough in knowing that Mrs. Smith would take care of her. The innkeeper wasn't the sort to leave anyone out in the cold. She'd cared for the Woolahan children when their parents had been killed in a terrible wagon accident, and they awaited their aunt and uncle to come for them. Nobody went hungry if she had anything to do with it, even if they couldn't afford to pay. Dakota was certain there were plenty of other charitable things Mrs. Soddy. Prosody rate. Smith had done that she didn't make public, and she would certainly take care of Beth too. Did you fall asleep with your eyes open? Dakota blinked, realizing he hadn't heard a word Sterling had said. Sorry, I'm just a little preoccupied at the moment. I can't say that I blame you, considering someone is trying to take your land out from underneath you. I'm just sorry that it's my father. If I had known about this in advance, I'd have warned you. The thing is, Father and I haven't been talking much. Now it was Sterling's turn to look off into the distance as he got lost in his thoughts. Not getting along? Dakota asked lightly, knowing that Sterling and Henry had never been particularly close. Sterling let out a wry laugh. You could say that. I've noticed he's become even more rancorous now that he's broken off his engagement to that woman. He's spiteful and cantankerous, even toward my grandmother. If he knows that you were the one who brought her to Mildred Smith, it might explain this. He wafted the papers. I thought I would be kind and offer to take some of the workload off of his shoulders, but he won't let me near the place. I would have thought he'd want you to take over the business one day. After all, hadn't Beckler brought Beth here to ensure his lineage in one way or the other? Why, then, wasn't he letting Sterling get to know the business? There's no telling with him, Sterling shrugged. I suppose he got hung up on the idea of having a new heir, too, someone who doesn't question him on what he's doing. And he would have been guaranteed that heir if he'd gone ahead and married Beth, Dakota thought, but he kept it to himself. It was much better for Beth and her child not to have to deal with Beckler. I was just on my way into town, Sterling said. I wanted to return this. He reached into his saddlebag. He drew out Dakota's falling axe, held it out to him. Dakota took it, eyeing the younger Beckler. You never did tell me what you were felling. A small smile flickered on Sterling's mouth. Ask no questions, Langhorne, and I'll tell no lies. Dakota narrowed his eyes, watching as Sterling mounted his ride and gathered up his reins. He wondered if he knew just how much his mannerisms mirrored his father's sometimes. Still, his amiable nature and easy smile meant that he would never be like Henry. Dakota stored the axe, saddled his horse, and made quick work of the ride into town. Dakota's mood was dark as he rode toward an attorney's office, hoping the man hadn't already been bought out by Beckler, but it instantly brightened when he saw Beth. She was heading toward the inn with a full basket on her arm, probably running some errands for Mrs. Smith. "Miss Morgan?" He pulled up and swung down from the saddle, instantly forgetting about his errand. "How nice to see you again." Her easygoing smile was quickly chased away when someone broke the look when they walked between them. "You'd probably be better off if nobody sees you talking with me, Mr. Langhorne." "Why is that? I'm not exactly welcome here." She glanced to the side, hesitating for a moment before she told him about Mr. Cath, Beckler coming to the inn and demanding that she leave town. Dakota hadn't thought he could get any more irate than he'd been when Henry had accused him of squatting, but this topped it all. "He can't just force you to leave town like that. You're not engaged to him, so he doesn't have anything to do with it." "Maybe not, but he said enough, and in front of enough people. Mayor Teague happened to be there, and he said I could stay while I save up some money to travel back to Baltimore. Then I'll have to go." She clasped her hands demurely around the handle of her basket. "But you don't have anyone in Baltimore," Dakota reminded her. "Nor anywhere else, but at least it's a city that I'm familiar with. I'm afraid I can't think of any other options, and at least an unwed mother isn't quite as noticeable in a big city," she reasoned. "There's got to be something else that can be done. I can help you find a solution, something more solid and permanent." His mind cast around for answers, but in his urgency, he couldn't find any. All he knew was that something had to be done. Beth shook her head. "I do thank you for everything you've tried to do for me, Mr. Langhorne. You've been very kind." She turned and headed back on her way toward the inn. Dakota watched her go, full of questions and objections. Beth wasn't interested in hearing anything he might have to say at the moment, and he couldn't blame her. Everything she'd tried so far had been hopeless, and she'd resigned herself to that. Though Beth's future was uncertain, there was one thing that he could be quite sure of. Dakota didn't need to stay away from her to protect her reputation. That Desmond back in Baltimore and Henry Beckler had done everything they could to ruin it, and a polite visit or two from him wouldn't hurt anything. She claimed she was going to have to leave anyway, though he didn't want her to. Dakota walked the rest of the way to the attorney's office, trying to think. Chapter 8. Here you are. Beth tried to keep her hands from shaking as she delivered a plate to a customer. Had this person been at the inn when Henry had made a scene and exposed her secret to the entirety of Silver Hill? "Thank you," was the only response. Beth quickly retreated to the safety of the kitchen. "You don't need to worry about hiding like that," Mrs. Smith reminded her, and not for the first time. "I feel as though I do." The shame that she had already been living with had only been compounded by her encounters with Henry, who had reminded her that nobody wanted to have anything to do with her. "I keep worrying that one day I'll wake up and nobody will come to your inn because of me," Mrs. Smith scoffed. "That's not going to happen. People need a place to stay, and they need food. It's been that way since there was nothing here but a canvas tent and some traders. They'll come regardless, and I'm not worried about it." She stepped out to the dining area. Beth was glad, but Mrs. Smith's relaxed attitude couldn't take away Beth's worries. Her time here in Silver Hill was limited. She had a plan, but it was one that did not sit well with her. She knew exactly what would happen when she got back to Baltimore, and she didn't look forward to it. "I need you to take 2 plates of biscuits and gravy out to the table near the hearth," Mrs. Smith said when she came back into the kitchen. "Yes, ma'am." They weren't very busy today, and Beth had a feeling that Mrs. Smith was only having her do this because she wanted to prove to Beth that she couldn't hide in the kitchen forever. Beth couldn't agree with her, nor could she refuse to do anything Mrs. Smith asked after all she'd done for her. Preparing the plate, she brought it out as asked. Dakota Langhorne was sitting at the table Mrs. Smith had indicated. Mr. Langhorne, she said, surprised. As I've told you before, you can call me Dakota, he reminded her. His dark eyes were kind. Here you go. Will your dining partner be along soon? Beth noted that the other chair was empty. She's already here. Dakota gestured for her to sit down. You can't protest since I've already cleared it with your boss. There was nothing Beth wanted more than to get off her feet and have some food, but she knew how it would look. He'd already been coming in a few times a week, and he'd always managed to find a way to talk to her for a while. Dakota, please, I don't even want to think about what people might say about you. I don't care, he insisted. Plenty of people in this town already have things to say about me, and that started long before you showed up. Have a seat and eat some food. Thank you. She looked to the side, wondering how many of the other diners were staring at her, and found that they were far more interested in their plates and their conversations. She hoped it stayed that way. Have you made any decisions? Dakota asked softly. Mrs. Smith made the absolute best biscuits and gravy, but they turned dry in her mouth the moment Beth started thinking about what would become of her. I've told you that I'll be going back to Baltimore. Dakota frowned. She didn't like to see him disappointed, though Beth had no reason to be concerned about how he felt about it. At least she knew she never had to worry about him exploding the same way that Henry did. Not that he didn't get angry. She'd seen the flash in his eyes when she'd told him about the way Henry had treated her, but it just wasn't the same. I know. He stirred the gravy with his fork tine. Long, black lashes covered his expressive eyes, sitting on his high cheekbones. His wide mouth was fixed into a flat line of dark thoughts. You also said that you don't have anyone to go to once you get there. Beth nodded, realizing that she'd never truly gone into why that was the case. I was raised in an orphanage. I was told my parents died when I was just a baby and there were no other relatives, or at least there hadn't been any who were willing to take me in. I see. And now you're still in the same situation. Yes. The front door opened, and Beth couldn't help but glance up, worried that it was Henry again. She hadn't seen him at all since he'd tried to run her out of town, and the mayor had stepped in, but she wouldn't be surprised if he returned. Henry was a man who wanted to get his way, and nothing else. I wrote to my friend Abby. She worked with me back at Desmond House. Dakota's face brightened visibly. Does she have some good prospects for you? A place where you could work and raise the baby? It was so kind of him to care, though Beth didn't know why he should. Mrs. Smith had said what a kind-hearted man Dakota Langhorne was, and perhaps that was all that was required. Beth hadn't met very many people like that. No, she informed him. I told her about my situation and that I'd be coming back for lack of any other option. I asked if she might be able to inquire ahead about anyone who would be interested in adopting the baby, perhaps a wealthy couple that hadn't been blessed with a family. He dropped his fork, causing several diners to look their way for a moment. You're going to give the baby up? Tears burned the backs of her eyes, which seemed to be a constant state for her these days. As in so many other things, I don't believe I have a choice. Nobody will hire me if they know I have a child, and yet I can't have a child without a position. I'll have to give the child to the orphanage, perhaps the very same one I grew up in. I have to think I might feel at least a little bit better about the situation if I know that the baby doesn't have to wait for someone to love them, if I have some guarantee. Does that make sense? Yes, Dakota admitted, although I wish there was a different way to go about this. I certainly can't think of one, nor do I like to entertain the idea of what it would be like if I attempted to stay here. Mr. Beckler won't rest until he knows I'm out of town. I get the idea that he would try anything just to make sure he got his way. That's true enough. Dakota's face tightened. Henry would probably be very happy if he could chase me right out of town with you. Beth recalled that she'd seen them arguing. I have to wonder if he has more enemies than friends. I don't think he has any friends at all, only the people he's paid to agree with him. He's been in a land battle with me for quite some time, and there's no low he won't sink to. Dakota ran a hand through his short, dark hair as he picked his fork back up. Mrs. Smith says that I'm better off without him no matter what else happens to me, Beth admitted. She knew she had a lot to contend with on her own, but she had to feel a little sorry for Dakota. She would leave at some point, but he would still be stuck here, trying to deal with Henry. Later that evening, when her work for the day was done and Beth was back in the little room Mrs. Smith had so generously given her, she began another letter. Abby, I know my first letter has hardly even had a chance to reach you. I do hope that it arrives swiftly. I do hate to burden you by asking for any help, but you're the only person I can rely on. I'm writing this letter not because I have anything new to share, but only to remind you to contact me as soon as you know anything. Forgive me for being so desperate. Her pen hovered above the paper as she realized she'd been on the verge of telling Abby all about Dakota Langhorne. He was a kind man, one who didn't like to see others suffering, even as he dealt with his own plights. Mrs. Smith thought a lot of him. Though it was clear that his equivalent parts of Navajo and white heritage had to be difficult for him, Beth had never heard anyone other than Henry say a negative word about him. He didn't even mind that her reputation could sully his own, choosing to sit with her in the dining area and offer a listening ear. More thoughts on Dakota entered her mind, but she pushed them aside. Beth didn't have any right to entertain thoughts about whether or not there could be anything between herself and Dakota. He deserved far better than her. She would miss him and their conversations when she returned to Baltimore. Chapter 9. Are you sure that's enough money? Mrs. Smith was usually a very jovial woman, joking with her customers and enjoying herself even while she was doing hard work. Now her frown was so deep that it created chasms in the soft skin of her face on either side of her mouth. I believe so. Beth had asked the innkeeper to come to her room, not wanting to display her small cache of money, nor wanting to discuss this near any customers. Though nobody had dared to defy Mrs. Smith and say a word against Beth, she wanted to keep this as private as possible. Humph. Mrs. Smith braced her hands on her hips. It's enough for the ticket. But what about after that? I mean, you're going to need to find a place to stay. Even if you eventually get a position in a house, that won't happen immediately. I know. Beth lamented over the fact that she hadn't heard anything back from Abby yet. She'd eagerly awaited a letter every day, hoping that Abby had been able to find some sort of solution that Beth hadn't thought of yet. Time had passed quickly by, and she would have to leave soon regardless of how much money she had. She tucked her savings back into her little bag and put it under her mattress before following Mrs. Smith back out into the front of the inn. Her body shape was already changing. Reminding her as the seasons began to change, that time did not stop for anyone. She'd already felt the fluttering deep with her. Each time she did, it brought on a fresh wave of heartache. Either way, I don't think I can wait much longer. Beth. She looked up to see that Dakota had just arrived. He was breathless, and when she glanced out the window, she saw that his horse was covered in sweaty foam. What's the matter? She asked, alarmed. Me. I've been a complete fool. Dakota boldly stepped forward and took his hand in hers. I know exactly what you need to do, and I don't know why I didn't suggest it a long time ago. Dakota, please. I appreciate how much you want to help, and you've already done so much. There's nothing else that I can do, though. I should be able to head back to Baltimore by next week, if not earlier. Beth didn't like the idea. The inn had begun to feel like home. It was a sensation so completely foreign to her. His dark eyes were full of light as they gazed into hers. No, you can't go, and you were never out of options. I thought you were. I think we both thought you were, but that was only because we were refusing to see what was right in front of our faces. Beth shook her head. Knowing that she would have to leave Silver Hill was hard enough. Yes, Henry Beckler would always be here, and that was certainly motivation to leave. For everything else, though, she wished she could stay. Please don't do this to me, Dakota. This has been hard enough. Mrs. Smith made a deep sound in her throat. Seems to me like you might want to hear what the young man has to say. She picked up her feather duster and slowly made her way off across the front parlor. Let me try this again. Dakota took a step toward her, dragging a hand through his inky black hair. his dark eyes alight with fervor. My thoughts are a bit jumbled. I knew what you needed the moment you told me of the trouble you were in. I just didn't think I was a qualified candidate. I'm not wealthy or influential. I'm just a simple farmer with a small house, and I even have to admit that I've got legal trouble because of Beckler. In many ways, I'm the absolute worst candidate. Beth tried to keep up with the words that stumbled over the other in his haste to get them out. He was threading the brim of his hat through his fingers, nervous energy rolling off him, which made her twitchy, too. Dakota, lips firm, he held up a hand, interrupting her. When he spoke again, his words were surer, his voice strong. I've always wanted a family. I hadn't thought about it before, but how I got that family was never all that important. Beth, I think you and I should. The front door flew open, startling Beth. A group of travelers stood outlined against the bright midday sun, and she gasped as they stepped over the threshold. Abby! Mrs. Desmond! Ah, there you are! Mrs. Desmond was a tall, thin woman. Her hair was piled elegantly on her head, with a neat hat perched fashionably on one side of her hair. She wore a thick traveling dress that had stood up to the long train ride, and she didn't seem the least bit bothered by the stagecoach ride they must have taken to get here. See now, Abby. She wasn't all that hard to find. You were right, ma'am. Oh, Beth. Abby rushed forward and wrapped Beth in a hug as Beth's mind struggled to believe what she was seeing. I was so worried that you might have already left before we arrived. Beth drew back, diving her attention between the two women. Mrs. Desmond was instructing the young man who was hauling their luggage across the threshold as Abby quietly asked her, "Did you get my letter?" Beth gaped at her, mystified. "No, I didn't. I've been waiting for one. It must have gotten lost on the way because I can't imagine that we arrived faster than it did. Especially not with packing," Abby replied. Her head swiveled back and forth between her friend and her former employer. "I don't understand. Why are you here?" Mrs. Desmond stepped forward and looped her arm through Beth's, guiding her over to a sofa along the back wall. "Forgive an old woman who has traveled far, but I think I need to sit down for a bit." Of course. Beth thought it would probably do her some good to sit as well, and she took the seat that Mrs. Desmond patted next to her. She was still so confused about all of this. "I got your letter," Abby explained, her face flushing a little. "I know it wasn't my place to do so, Beth, but I told Mrs. Jones. I thought it was important enough that I should do that." "Yes, it certainly was," Mrs. Desmond concluded with a slap of her gloved hand on her thigh. "And dear Mrs. Jones came to me. I was very sad to see you go, Beth. You were a wonderful employee, and I hated that we had to lose you. I thought, however, that you were moving on to bigger and better things, namely with this Beckler that you'd found." "That didn't exactly work out the way I'd hoped," Beth murmured. So I heard. And I understand that my son is the reason you're in this current delicate position." Mrs. Desmond's slim eyebrows rose nearly up to her hairline as she waited for confirmation of what she'd been told. Beth swallowed, feeling so shameful. "Yes, ma'am." "Well, I'm just horrified, absolutely mortified to know that my own flesh and blood would do such a thing to one of our maids. To coerce an innocent." She cut the words off, gave a little shake of her head. "I'm so very sorry, Beth. I thought he was raised better than that." Beth stared at the thick rug under her feet, waiting for the scolding that she'd known would come. Mrs. Desmond hadn't needed to come all the way out to Colorado to do it, though. Beth felt bad enough as it was. The older woman patted Beth's knee. "Let me reassure you that Hayward is being thoroughly punished. He's been stripped of his allowance, and he'll have to get a job for himself if he'd like any income." Beth's head snapped up. This wasn't at all what she'd expected. "Now don't you worry one little bit, Beth. You hear me. This child will still be very well cared for. It's my grandchild, however. It came to be, and that's all that matters. Abby and I will rest here for a few days, but then we'll take you right back to civilization with us in Baltimore. You'll have a home and support while you raise this child. I'll make sure that Hayward stays out of your way." Mrs. Desmond sat back, looking proud of herself. I don't know what to say," Beth replied honestly. She'd been searching so hard and so long for some chance, some way to make everything work. She'd thought marrying Henry and passing the child off as his would be just the ticket. But she'd been wrong, and her sense of morality had landed her here. Then she'd hoped to stay in Silver Hill and carve out a life for her new little family, but she'd been wrong about that too. "Tell her how wonderful it is," Abby encouraged. "You'll get to come back to Desmond House, and you won't have to adopt the baby out to anyone." When Mrs. Desmond asked if I would come with her as her lady's maid for the trip, I had to say yes. I wanted to see your face when you found out the good news. "Yes," Beth said quietly, still trying to understand it all. She was lucky, and she knew that. Women in her position didn't get these sorts of chances. Still, something bothered her. "Does this, and forgive me for asking, but does this mean I'll have to marry Hayward?" Mrs. Desmond snorted. "Not at all, my dear. I did consider that option, and I know that many would think it was the right one. I can understand the logic and reason behind it. After all, a woman can't do all of this on her own. But after what Hayward has done, I wouldn't want to punish you like that. I'm a much more modern woman than I look." She smiled again. "We might have to do a little bit of fibbing, perhaps say you're a widow to explain away the child, but I won't have my first grandchild be treated poorly because of his idiot father." "Thank you," Beth said. She still felt so overwhelmed. "I should go and tell Mrs. Smith." I heard. Mrs. Smith stepped into the room, having been listening from behind the door. "I'm so glad to hear it. And see, you didn't think you had anyone out in Baltimore." "Yes, it turns out I've more friends than I imagined. That included those back east, as well as those here in Colorado." Remembering that she'd been speaking to Dakota only a few moments ago, Beth looked around for him. He was nowhere in sight. She didn't see his horse through the window either. A sadness wrapped around her heart. Her child would be warm, fed, safe, and loved. Dakota had heard this and left immediately, probably realizing that he no longer had to be so charitable. There was little time to grieve in the whirlwind that followed the good news. "Let's get you ladies set up in a room for the night," Mrs. Smith insisted, her chatelaine rattling at her hip as she sorted through her keys and guided the newcomers upstairs. "I think I have just the one for you. And Beth, don't you worry at all about your regular duties this evening. I'm sure you'll want to be catching up and making plans." "Yes, ma'am." As she followed them up the stairs, Beth looked around her at the inn. It had become her home in the short amount of time that she'd been staying here. She should be so grateful that her fortune had changed, and she did not doubt that Mrs. Desmond would hold to her word. This was a far better option than leaving her child at the orphanage and trying to find enough work to support herself. In so many ways, she had nothing left to worry about. Even so, she felt as though she'd be leaving her heart in Colorado. Chapter 10. "There you go. Drink deeply, my friend. I'm sorry that we had to do so much hard riding today, and all for nothing." Dakota loosely held the reins in his hand, while his horse took a deep drink of the clear creek water. He was back on his land, in the shade of the trees that he let grow in any place that he didn't need clear for farming. His property looked far different than those of the people around him. Rather than plunder it for every resource it could offer in as short of a time as possible, he liked to know that the land was thriving just as much as he was. Right now, though, he didn't feel as though he was thriving at all. He'd come up with the perfect solution for Beth's problem, one that had been staring him in the face ever since she'd burst out of the woods. Dakota had known right at that moment that there was something special between them. He'd felt a connection, one that may not make sense to society considering that they didn't know each other, but it was there nonetheless. "I think that's about enough," he said quietly, rubbing the horse's neck as it lifted its head. Water dripped from the equine's lips as it turned to him questioningly. "I know it's good, but you're going to make yourself sick if you drink too much." Just as he'd made himself sick from hoping too much. Dakota turned toward his home, choosing to walk instead of ride. His poor mount needed a break after that thunderous ride into town and back again. He shook his head at his own foolish pride in thinking he could be the key to everything for Beth. He'd waited until the last possible moment when he'd known he was finally running out of time to finally go to her and tell her just how he felt. An urgency had arisen in him as he'd realized he had to get to her before she boarded a train and headed east. Beth hadn't even made it to the station yet, but he'd still been too late. The wound cut his heart like a knife. Dakota could feel the dappled sunshine on his shoulders through the trees overhead, but it didn't bring him any warmth against the cool breeze that pierced his shirt. In one moment, he'd known exactly what the rest of his life would be like. In the very next, with the simple arrival of two women at the inn, those dreams had been dashed. The cabin appeared ahead of him on the narrow path he'd taken through the woods, instead of going the long way around on the road and up the driveway. It was a simple home, one he'd built with his own hands. He'd touched every log that made up the walls and every stone that created the chimney. The front porch had been merely a thought that first year, because his concern had been more for the barn than for his enjoyment and comfort. Once the work had begun, though, he'd hammered in every board himself. Dakota had guided his future with those efforts, and it had made him feel proud. There was still one part of his life that had yet to be completed, but he couldn't make it happen with a hammer or a saw. He didn't know how to make it happen at all. Dakota stopped at the barn first, taking the saddle from his horse's back and cleaning the foamy sweat from its hide. He'd left the inn as soon as he'd understood Mrs. Desmond's plan for Beth. She would be taking her back to Baltimore. That could only mean one thing for her, considering she was bearing Hayward Desmond's child. Beth would be married off to this high society heir, the very man who'd put her in her current position and hadn't cared a bit about what trouble it would cause for her or the child. Anger flushed through his body, but he kept his movements calm and even. Horses could sense these things, and there was no need to upset the poor creature. He uttered. Releasing the horse into the pasture, Dakota leaned on the fence and watched as it jogged out to find the best grass to graze on. Would Beth be treated any differently than livestock on a farm? Did Mrs. Desmond truly care about her, or was she only letting her back into the family so that she might have access to her grandchild? These were questions that Dakota couldn't possibly answer. The only thing he truly knew was that rich people always got their way, and it didn't matter who he ran over to get it. This Hayward Desmond was about to get Beth, and Henry Beckler was fighting hard to get Dakota's land. Was there going to be anything left for him in the end? He couldn't be sure. Chapter 11. I just can't wait, Abby exclaimed, not for the first time. She and Beth sat at a quiet table at the inn, drinking tea. The crowds that often flocked to the Siler Hill Lodge had died down between mealtimes. There was little for Beth to do. Even though Mrs. Smith had insisted that she no longer needed to do any work at all, Beth didn't like the idea of staying here without giving the kind woman at least something in return. Right now, she would have simply liked something to keep her hands busy. It's going to be so wonderful to have you back under the same roof, Abby went on. I mean, I know it'll be a bit different now. You're not exactly just going to be part of the staff. But not exactly part of the family either, Beth noted. Abby's blonde brows crinkled. You're not saying you'd rather marry Hayward, are you? Goodness, no, Beth protested. The thought was a terrifying one. Mrs. Desmond's promise that she didn't have to do such a thing was a great comfort to her. There were, however, plenty of other things to worry about. I can't say that I'm excited about living back in his home, though, even if it is temporary. I trust Mrs. Desmond will keep him busy, as she says. Besides, he's got to go and get himself a job somewhere now. She told me he might go see that cousin of his about just such a thing, which means he'll be in Annapolis most of the time. Yes. Still, something didn't sit right with Beth about the whole thing. Abby bit her lip and leaned forward. Forgive me for saying so, but I keep getting the feeling that you don't want to come home to Baltimore. That was something that Beth had been contemplating herself. Even as she packed her meager belongings and prepared for the journey, knowing that she was doing the best thing for her baby, doubt had constantly clouded her mind. I think it's just that there's something I need to do first. I'll be back a little bit later. "But where are you going?" Abby asked as Beth got up from the table. "It's just something I have to do before I leave." She knew she could tell Abby anything, but she had to be sure before she could say any of the words out loud. The savings she'd put together for the train ticket would no longer be needed, as Mrs. Desmond had insisted on paying Beth's fare back to Baltimore. Beth rented a small cart and a drowsy horse, hoping that she remembered the way. It wasn't all that difficult, really. The property was right near the Beckler silver mine, after all, and Henry had ensured that anyone who wanted to find his place could get there without having to ask directions. Beth turned off the main road, ignoring the fine house where she might have lived if she'd wanted to do so under the heavy hand of Henry Beckler, and followed the track. Her stomach jumped inside her, hoping this wasn't a mistake. If it was, at least she'd be leaving the next day before she had too much of a chance to be humiliated by her efforts. The land leading up to Dakota's house was just as she remembered it, shady and cool, the tree branches overhead like loosely clasped fingers. The horse hadn't been particularly excitable, and it was easy enough to bring him to a stop before the porch. On shaking knees, Beth climbed the stairs and knocked on the door. She waited and knocked again. There was no answer. Her heart sank into her boots as she turned and descended the steps. "Beth?" Dakota came around the side of the house, his eyes full of questions. He glanced at the horse, whose head was drooping toward the ground as he dozed, and then back up at her. "What are you doing here? I thought you were leaving for Baltimore." "Soon." The lump in her throat was so big, she was surprised she could get any words out around it. "Mrs. Desmond is eager to get back." "I should imagine so. Silver Hill probably isn't her kind of place." Beth smiled a little. "She's surprisingly adaptable, but I do think she's ready to be home." A cloud passed over his face. "I guess you are too." "Not exactly," she admitted as she took the final step off the porch. "I never expected her to come out here, you see. I didn't think that anything like this would ever happen. I'm lucky, and I know I should be grateful, but there are so many things about Silver Hill that I'm going to miss." His eyes traced over her face and then drifted off into the distance. "Such as?" "Well, Mrs. Smith, for one. She's been very kind to me, and she gave me a chance when many wouldn't. She's introduced me to quite a few of the other people around town, many of whom are far more tolerant than Henry would have anyone believe." She paused, knowing this last part was the hardest to say and yet the most important. "And you." His eyes cut back to her. "Beth, I don't think you know what you're talking about. You're about to go back to a big home and a lavish life. You'll have a rich husband, and no." Her heart skipped as she realized what Dakota thought was happening. "I'm not marrying Hayward." She saw his throat bob as he swallowed. "You're not?" "I couldn't. Not ever." She would do anything in the world but that. "Dakota, you came to the inn to tell me something." He shrugged and looked off into the woods again. "It was just something that I thought might help your problem, but you don't need it now. You've already got all of that figured out, and in a much better way." "I'm not convinced of that," she confessed. Beth could see what he was doing. He'd only ever cared about what was best for her, ever since she'd met him. She dared to take a few steps closer. "I could go and be cared for by the Desmonds, but I can't possibly leave Silver Hill until I know what you were going to say." Dakota ran a hand through his hair. He was hesitant when his eyes met hers, but then his look softened as he shook his head. "I feel like a fool saying it now." "Please," she urged. Beth thought she knew what he'd been about to say, and she didn't want to spend the rest of her life wondering if she'd been right. "Beth?" He took her hand between his. "I've always wanted a family. I never knew exactly what I wanted that family to look like until I met you. I believe that the two of us would make a good couple, and I would be more than happy to raise this child as my own. And I don't want you to think that I'm only doing this out of kindness or pity. I love you, Beth, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." "Oh, Dakota, I was so hoping you would say that." Her heart swelled with joy at hearing that from his lips. "Are you sure?" He pulled her closer, looking deep into her eyes to make sure that she understood. "I'm not a rich man. I don't have a lot to offer you except for a loving home. Yes, I don't need anything else. I only need you." She could say that with every certainty now that she'd been offered a chance to go back to Desmond House. I can't even promise you that we won't continue to have problems with Henry. He's trying his best to take my lands from me, and I don't know how that's going to go. She clasped her fingers tightly around his. Then we'll fight him together. We'll figure it out. Then let's make this official. Beth, will you marry me? Yes, Dakota. I'd love to. Chapter 12. 3 years later. Now you can put the seed right in there, Beth directed gently. In the hole? Jeremiah pointed a chubby finger into the little trench that Beth had made with her trowel. He held a fistful of dried beans in his hand, some of which were slowly dropping out the backside. She smiled at his sweet innocence. Yes, right there, and you have to spread them out a little so that they have room to grow. Like this? He plopped several beans on the ground. Just like that. Now you can use your fingers to pull the dirt over them. She rubbed her swelling belly as she straightened her back, glad that Jeremiah was old enough to be such a help. Am I doing it right, Mama? Jeremiah looked up at her with an eager joy, hopeful that he'd done the job right. Yes, my dear. Beth looked down at his dark hair and brown eyes. The hair was the same as her own, but it could easily have been tied to Dakota. The eyes had been Hayward's, but nobody here in Silver Hill who hadn't known of her plight when she'd first arrived would guess. They were the same deep shade of chestnut that Dakota had. Beth knew that Dakota had been complimented several times on how much his son looked like him. He knew the truth, of course, but he didn't mind. Jeremiah was his. Daddy's home. Jeremiah jumped up from the soft earth of the garden and ran around the side of the house to greet Dakota as he rode up the lane. Daddy! Dakota laughed, reaching down to pull the little boy up into the saddle in front of him so they could ride together to the barn. You've got a lot of dirt on your hands. You must have been busy. We were planting a garden, Jeremiah stated proudly. And what did you plant? Beans. Great big beans. Dakota's laugh mingled with the bird song and the sound of the breeze in the trees. Really? I always used to plant little tiny beans. They're tiny now, but Mama said they'll get big like me, came Jeremiah's very serious reply. Just like you, right? Dakota rubbed his knuckles gently in his son's hair. Beth smiled as she listened to them chatting. She never knew life could be so good, and it was impossible not to reflect on her good fortune every chance she got. Her youth had been difficult. Growing up in the orphanage meant a lot of hard labor, very little food, and nobody who truly cared about her. Knowing how to mop floors and beat rugs had done her a bit of a service when she'd been able to get hired on as a maid. But of course that had its downside as well. Beth hadn't been sure of what she would do with her life then, but Dakota had come along and made everything better. He had a habit of doing that, she was finding out. Dakota expertly dealt with dismounting his ride and lifting Jeremiah down in one smooth motion. He handed the boy the reins so he could lead the horse into the barn. The animal, instinctively knowing that Jeremiah was young and delicate, plodded softly along behind him. Beth held his steady gaze, a contented smile on her face as she watched her husband walk towards her. Even now, her heart thrummed at the sight of him. How are you? Dakota kissed her delicately on the cheek, cupping his hand around her jaw. I see that Jeremiah has been working hard, but I hope you haven't been. As if I could help it, she replied with a laugh. Beth knew he worried about her, but there was always work to be done. He's been a wonderful help, though. I think he'll just about be running the place by the time I'm ready to have this baby. Dakota's free hand grazed across the bump underneath her dress. I can't wait to meet him or her. You think they'll get along? Beth smiled. Jeremiah and the baby? They will if Jeremiah has anything to do with it. He talks about the baby constantly. He's even insisted on putting in some of the stitches when I work on the layette during the hottest part of the afternoon. Yes, I think they'll do just fine together. Jeremiah stood in the barn doorway. Pa, I can't reach his saddle. I'm coming. Dakota stepped into the barn, Beth behind him. He unbuckled the cinch, but then paused and reached for the saddlebag. I almost forgot. I stopped at the post office, and there was a letter for you. Beth accepted the letter and noted the return address. It's from Mrs. Desmond. Grandma? Jeremiah squinted up at her, and Beth ruffled his hair. The very same. Beth broke the seal on the letter and began to read. The day that she'd explained to Mrs. Desmond that she wouldn't be returning to Baltimore because she'd fallen in love would be one that she'd never forget. She'd been prepared for the shock and disappointment of her former employer, but not for the generous financial gift that she'd given them for their wedding once she'd realized how serious the two of them were. Her only request was that she be allowed to stay in touch with the child and that Beth would send him to a school back east when the time came, paid for by Desmond money. Dakota pulled the saddle off the horse and put it on a nearby stand. "What does she say?" Beth glanced up at him. His tone was even as he dealt with untacking the horse and adding hay to the stall. Still, she often wondered if it bothered him that Jeremiah's blood family was still in his life. Jeremiah was splashing in the water now, and Beth quietly said, "You don't mind, do you? I mean, that Mrs. Desmond wants to be a part of Jeremiah's life?" Dakota also looked at Jeremiah, and a slow but happy smile stretched across his face. "No, I'll admit that I was a bit worried when we told her you wouldn't be going back to Baltimore and that you'd be staying here to marry me. She's a wealthy woman, and you know I haven't had the best experience with moneyed folks who want to get their way." "I know." Beth glanced to the west, where their property line butted up against Beckler Silver. Henry had been the only fly in the ointment of her new life, though Dakota marrying Beth had silenced the other naysayers in the town. Beth had insisted on using some of the money that Mrs. Desmond had insisted on giving to them as a wedding present for finding an attorney brave enough to see to it that Henry left them alone, instead of trying to boot Dakota off the land that he'd legally owned. Dakota had introduced her to Sterling, who was a remarkably kind man considering who his father was. After she'd met Sterling, she agreed with Dakota's assessment. Father and son were not cut from the same cloth. Since Isabella's sudden passing, Henry had turned into a recluse, yet Sterling still had not been granted access to the mining business. "Overall, my love, I think that the more family there is to love a child, the better. She's his grandmother, regardless of how that came to be the case, and I like knowing that there's someone in the world who cares about Jeremiah as much as we do." "What? Why are you smiling at me like that?" "Because I think you're wonderful." Beth leaned in and kissed his cheek. "I've always thought so, but you just keep proving it." "Are Sterling and Delilah still coming for dinner?" Dakota nodded. "I saw him in town, and he confirmed it. He also said they have good news for us." "I wonder what that could be," Beth mused. "I'd better get back in the kitchen and finish getting things prepared. Should I bring Jeremiah with me, or would you like him to stay out here with you?" "He can stay for a bit, and then we'll both be in to help." Later that evening, as the sun was starting to sink, and the sky was turning glorious shades of gold and pink on the horizon, Sterling and his fiancée Delilah Wilmhoff arrived. Delilah wore a beautiful dress dotted with little pink rosebuds that matched the blush on her cheeks. "I do hope Sterling remembered to tell you that I was bringing dessert." "He did, and I'm rather happy that you did. My ankles are starting to swell," Beth replied as she hugged her new friend. Sterling had started courting Delilah several months ago, and Beth had immediately liked her. She was bright and happy, and she was the sort who could always find something to talk about. "Then you sit down and let me finish this up." Delilah ushered Beth over to a chair. "What needs to be done yet?" "I just need to set the table and get the rolls out of the oven," Beth replied, feeling guilty. Delilah came from a well-connected family, yet hadn't once cast aspersions over the humbler Langhorne cabin. "You're our guest, and I don't want to put the burden on you." Delilah flapped her hands at Beth as she took the plates from the hutch. "Don't be silly. I plan to be around plenty once that baby comes. With a little bit of luck, I'll need your help in return once Sterling and I are married." Beth smiled and relaxed a little. "I can't wait, you know. I think the two of you make a wonderful couple. Speaking of, what is this good news that Sterling was teasing Dakota about? I can't imagine any better news than the fact that the two of you are betrothed." Delilah had already been smiling, but now she grinned and her eyes sparkled. "Oh, that'll have to wait until we're all here. I think Sterling wants to be able to tell the two of you for himself. Is someone getting impatient? Sterling asked as he walked in. He and Dakota had secured the horses and the cart in the barn and washed up at the pump outside. Beth, you're positively glowing. You're a charmer, but I'll let you get away with it this time, she returned. When everyone was seated and ready to eat, Dakota looked at his old friend. How long are you going to make us wait? Not a second longer, Sterling promised. There are two good pieces of news we'd like to share with you. The first is that we've bought the property just to the east of you. We're going to be neighbors. Oh, how delightful! Beth reached across the table to clasp hands with Delilah. We really will be able to be there for each other, just as you were saying. I know. I hated not telling you right away. Our children will be able to grow up together. The thought was almost enough to make Beth sob with joy. Now, the second part is a bit more serious, Sterling continued. Beth exchanged a look with her husband, then Delilah, who was quivering with excitement. Sterling straightened his shoulders proudly. I've known for a long time that my father wasn't running his business the way he should. I had tried to talk to him about it, especially once he started coming after your land, but he didn't want to listen to me. I hired a private detective, as well as an attorney of my own. It turns out Henry Beckler has been breaking the law everywhere he can, just so he can feel like he's ahead. I brought all the evidence to him, copies of course, and I told him that if he didn't let me buy out Beckler's silver for pennies on the dollar, I'd take him to court and have him prosecuted for his crimes. Dakota slapped his hand on the table in disbelief. You did? I did. It's not an easy thing to question your father, but I never could stand seeing what he was doing to other people. Heath, as I was getting ready to start a family of my own, I knew I had to do the responsible thing and stand up for him. The idea of jail wasn't exactly something Henry Beckler could handle. He'll be moving to a nice little place in South Carolina where he can retire, and you're now looking at the new owner of Beckler Silver. Cheers and congratulations were shared all around, and it was such a beautiful moment that Beth could hardly believe it. Her skies had been bright and sunny ever since she'd married Dakota, but the very last rain cloud on the horizon had now been chased away. Her children were not only going to grow up in a loving home, they would never have to worry about Henry Beckler again. She had Dakota at her side, through thick and thin. She was a lucky woman indeed. The end.